Picture this. You're standing on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey. It's 12,000 years ago. The wind cuts across the limestone ridge, carrying dust and the smell of wild grasses. Below you, the Harran Plain stretches out in every direction, an endless landscape of rocks and scrub and scattered herds of gazelle. There are no cities here, no farms, no roads, nothing that looks like civilization as we understand it. But all around you, something impossible is happening. Dozens of people are hauling massive stone pillars across the plateau. These aren't small stones. They're towering T-shaped monoliths, some weighing over 16 tons. That's heavier than 2 full-grown elephants. And these people are moving them without wheels, without metal tools, without ropes made of anything stronger than plant fibers, without domesticated animals to help pull the load. They're doing it with their bare hands, wooden levers, and sheer determination. And they're not just moving the pillars, they're carving them, shaping them, decorating them with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, creatures that stalk and hunt and kill. Then they're arranging these pillars in perfect circles, sinking them deep into bedrock, creating enclosed spaces that feel almost sacred. This is Göbekli Tepe, and it should not exist. Here's why this place is so mind-bending. The people building this monumental complex were hunter-gatherers. They had no permanent villages, no agriculture, no pottery, no metal. According to everything archaeologists thought they knew about human history, these people weren't supposed to be capable of creating something like this. Monumental architecture was supposed to come later, much later, after farming, after settlements, after complex societies with hierarchies and specialized labor. But Göbekli Tepe was built roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It's older than writing, older than the wheel, older than civilization itself as we've traditionally defined it. And yet here it stands, the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth, created by people who supposedly lack the social complexity to pull it off. So, what compelled them? What force was powerful enough to make nomadic hunter-gatherers quarry and carve and move stones weighing tons? What vision drove them to return to this hilltop generation after generation to build and rebuild these circular temples? That's the Göbekli Tepe paradox, and it's rewriting everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization. Over the next hours, we're going to explore how this place was discovered, what archaeologists have found there, who built it, and why. We'll look at the wild theories, the careful science, and the profound questions this ancient site raises about human nature itself. And if you're enjoying mysteries like this from our deep past, you might like the Sleepy Time History book about prehistoric secrets, available at sleepytimehistory.com. But first, we need to go back to 1963, to a hilltop that had been waiting in silence for almost 12,000 years. The site sits at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and the Levant where agriculture first took root, where human civilization supposedly began. But in 1963, when archaeologists first examined the hilltop, they had no idea they were standing on something far older than agriculture itself. The survey was conducted jointly by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University. Professional work, systematic documentation. They were cataloguing archaeological sites across the region, trying to build a comprehensive picture of ancient settlements. When they reached Göbekli Tepe, they noted the unusual limestone fragments scattered across the surface. Broken pieces of worked stone, flint tools, clear evidence of human activity. But there was something else. Large stone slabs jutting from the earth at odd angles. T-shaped stones that appeared to mark burial sites. The archaeologists recorded their observations and made their assessment. Medieval cemetery, not particularly significant in the grand scheme of regional archaeology. They moved on to the next site. For 31 years that assessment stood. The hilltop returned to silence. Shepherds grazed their flocks there. Farmers cleared stones from the surface to make room for crops. The T-shaped pillars that poke through the soil were occasionally used as building material for nearby villages. Nobody imagined they were destroying evidence of the world's oldest temple complex. Then in October 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at the site. This wasn't his first visit to the region. Schmidt had spent years working at Mythology, another pre-pottery Neolithic site about 30 miles north. There, he'd excavated circular structures with T-shaped pillars, smaller than what he was about to find, but similar enough that he'd developed an eye for them. When Schmidt climbed Göbekli Tepe and saw those T-shaped stones protruding from the ground, something clicked. These weren't medieval grave markers. The proportions were wrong. The stone was wrong. The context was wrong. He recognized immediately what previous surveyors had missed. These were megalithic pillars, and if they were anything like the structures at Nevelachori, they were ancient beyond reckoning. Schmidt later described that moment as one of instant recognition, like an art historian identifying a lost masterpiece by its brushstrokes. He knew, standing on that wind-swept hilltop, that he was looking at something extraordinary. Within months he'd secured funding and permits. By 1995, systematic excavation began. What emerged from the earth defied expectations from the first season. The pillars weren't small, they weren't crude. They were massive, precisely carved limestone monuments, arranged in circular enclosures. As workers carefully removed millennia of accumulated soil and debris, they realized something even more remarkable. The site hadn't been abandoned and naturally buried by wind and erosion. It had been deliberately filled in. Someone had hauled thousands of tons of dirt and rubble to bury these structures completely, intentionally, systematically. The excavation revealed enclosures roughly circular in shape, each centered on two massive T-shaped pillars. Smaller pillars ring the perimeter, creating enclosed spaces that felt deliberately sacred. The pillars themselves range from 10 to 16 feet tall, some weighing more than 16 tons. Their surfaces were covered with carved reliefs, animals rendered in startling detail, scorpions with curved tails, foxes mid-prowl, vultures with wings spread, bulls charging, snakes coiling. But it was the dating results that truly stunned the archaeological community. Radiocarbon analysis of organic material from the lowest layers pushed the site's construction back to roughly 9,600 BCE at the earliest. The complex remained in use for perhaps 1,500 years, with the latest activity dating to around 8,000 BCE. This placed Göbekli Tepe firmly in the pre-pottery Neolithic A and B periods, a time when humans were still hunting and gathering, a time when permanent settlements were just beginning to emerge, a time when, according to every established model of cultural evolution, people shouldn't have been building monumental architecture. Schmidt made this point repeatedly in interviews and publications. His famous declaration that everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization was wrong wasn't hyperbole. It was a simple statement of fact. Göbekli Tepe existed 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. It predated agriculture in the region. It predated pottery. It predated everything we associated with the social complexity necessary to organize and execute such massive construction projects. The implications were staggering. For decades, archaeologists had assumed civilization followed a neat progression. First came agriculture, then permanent settlements, then population growth, then social stratification and specialized labor, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reversed that sequence. Here was monumental architecture built by mobile hunter-gatherers. The temple came before the city, religion before agriculture, sacred space before domestic space. The excavations continued year after year, revealing more enclosures, more pillars, more carvings. Each season brought new questions, and as word spread through the archaeological community, researchers began looking at other sites in the region with fresh eyes. What else had they missed? Let's take a moment to really understand what they found, because the more you look at Göbekli Tepe, the stranger it becomes. The site they've excavated so far, everything you've ever seen in photographs or documentaries, represents maybe 5% of the total complex, probably less. Geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have detected at least 20 distinct enclosures buried beneath the hilltop. 20 separate circular structures, each potentially as elaborate as the ones already uncovered. Most are still under the earth, waiting. Some will probably never be excavated. There aren't enough archaeologists, enough funding, enough time. The hill keeps its secrets, but what they have revealed is extraordinary enough. The heart of Göbekli Tepe consists of these circular or oval enclosures, each built to a similar but not identical pattern. The excavated structures, designated enclosure A, B, C, D and so on, follow a basic architectural logic. Imagine standing in the centre of one. Two massive T-shaped pillars rise before you, facing each other like silent sentinels. They're the giants, the anchors of the space. Around the perimeter, smaller pillars form a ring, creating an enclosed area perhaps 30 feet across. Between these pillars, low stone walls sometimes fill the gaps, completing the circle. The pillars themselves are the real miracle. Carved from limestone bedrock at quarries located on the slopes of the hill itself, some stand over 16 feet tall, 5 meters of solid stone rising from bedrock floors that were carved level to receive them. The largest weigh between 10 and 15 tons. Think about that for a moment. 10 tons. That's the weight of 6 or 7 cars. And these people, these hunter-gatherers without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals, they quarried these monoliths, carved them, transported them, and raised them upright with a precision that's hard to achieve even with modern equipment. The quarries show how they did it, or at least the beginning of the process. Workers carved trenches around the pillars, leaving them attached to the bedrock by a narrow base. Then they cut underneath, probably using wooden wedges that expanded when soaked with water, creating enough force to crack the stone free. But getting a 15-ton pillar from quarry to enclosure, then raising it vertical and stabilizing it, that required engineering knowledge we're still trying to understand. The socket holes they carved to receive the pillar bases show incredible precision. Too shallow, and the pillar topples. Too deep, and you can't maneuver it into position. But the real revelation, the thing that transforms these pillars from mere stones into something otherworldly, is their anthropomorphic character. They aren't just T-shaped abstractions, they're representations of beings. Look closely at the carvings and you see it. Arms bent at the elbows, hands meeting at the front, belts carved in relief around the narrow waist where the shaft meets the crossbar, sometimes clothing, loincloths or kilts, suggested by carved lines. But no faces. Never faces. The top of the T remains blank, featureless, as if the identity of these beings is something beyond human comprehension. They're humanoid, but not quite human. Too tall, too rigid, too perfectly geometric. Archaeologists describe them as highly stylized human figures, but that doesn't quite capture it. They feel like something else. Ancestors, maybe. Gods, spirits. Representations of forces that existed in the cosmology of the builders, beings important enough to warrant tons of limestone carved in their image. And then there are the animals, hundreds of them, carved in low relief across the surfaces of the pillars and on smaller stone blocks scattered throughout the enclosures. This is where Göbekli Tepe becomes a bestiary, a catalogue of the creatures that shared the world with its builders. Foxes appear frequently, carved with such detail you can see individual tufts of fur. Snakes coil and twist, some rendered naturalistically, others stylized into geometric patterns. Wild boars charge across stone surfaces, their tusks prominent, their power obvious. Cranes stand in profile, long-legged and alert. Vultures spread their wings, sometimes holding what might be human heads in their talons. Scorpions appear with their tails curved, ready to strike. Lions prowl. Spiders hang suspended. Gazelles leap. Bulls lower their horns. Every enclosure contains its own population of carved creatures, sometimes dozens on a single pillar. They are not random. The same animals appear again and again, suggesting they held symbolic meaning. A cosmology rendered in stone, though we can only guess at the stories these images told. Some pillars show animals that seem to be interacting. A scorpion positioned above a vulture, a snake approaching a boar. Whether these represent narratives, seasonal cycles, or something more abstract, we don't know. The people who understood this language have been gone for 11,000 years. What we do know is that someone chose which animals to carve and where to carve them. Someone decided the central pillars in Enclosure D should be covered with foxes, while Enclosure C features more snakes and boars. These weren't random decorations. They were deliberate choices carrying meaning that mattered enough to justify the enormous effort required to carve them. And here's something that makes it all even stranger. The enclosures weren't permanent. Göbekli Tepe wasn't built and then gradually abandoned as structures decayed. It was systematically decommissioned. When a generation decided an enclosure had served its purpose, they filled it in, completely, deliberately. They hauled thousands of tons of dirt, rubble, broken stone tools, animal bones and debris, and buried the entire structure. Then they built a new one nearby, starting the process over. The fill layers show this wasn't accidental. It's too uniform, too intentional. Someone organized work parties to bury sacred spaces that had taken years to construct. And they did this repeatedly over the 15 centuries the site remained active. The oldest structures lie deepest, perfectly preserved by the rubble that covered them. The youngest was still being used when the site was finally abandoned entirely around 8000 BCE. Why? Why bury something so magnificent? That's a question we'll return to. But for now, just consider what it means. These people built temples, used them for a generation or two, then ritually entombed them before starting again. The hilltop became a palimpsest, layers of sacred architecture built on the graves of earlier sacred architecture. 20 enclosures, perhaps more, each representing a cycle of construction, use, and deliberate burial. We've barely scratched the surface. So who were they? The people who carved these pillars, who organized the labor, who buried and rebuilt their temples generation after generation. They weren't farmers. That's the first thing you need to understand, and it's the thing that changes everything. When Klaus Schmidt first dated Göbekli Tepe to 9500 BCE, he knew immediately he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Because 9500 BCE is pre-pottery Neolithic A. That's the archaeological designation, and embedded in that term is an assumption that had governed our understanding of human development for nearly a century. Pottery comes after agriculture. Agriculture comes after settlement. Settlement comes after hunter-gatherers figure out farming and complex social organization, the kind required to build something like Göbekli Tepe, that comes last of all. Except here was proof that the sequence was wrong. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who hadn't domesticated plants yet, hadn't domesticated animals, weren't living in permanent villages. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile bands moving through the landscape, following game herds, harvesting wild resources, and somehow they built the most sophisticated architectural complex of their age. Let's paint a picture of their world, because it wasn't the marginal existence we often imagine when we think of hunter-gatherers. The northern Fertile Crescent around 9500 BCE was rich, absurdly rich by the standards of most environments humans inhabited. This was the tail end of the Younger Dryas, that brief return to Ice Age conditions that had gripped the region for over 1,000 years. As the climate warmed again, the landscape exploded into life. Picture-rolling hills covered with wild cereals, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley growing in dense stands across the valleys, wild lentils, chickpeas, pistachios, almonds. These weren't scattered patches that required hours of searching. These were fields, naturally occurring fields that could support substantial populations just through harvesting what already grew. Archaeobotanical evidence from sites across the region shows people were collecting and processing wild grains on an industrial scale. They had grinding stones, storage facilities, entire toolkits dedicated to harvesting and preparing plant foods they never planted. And the animals. The region supported massive herds, gazelles by the thousands migrating through predictable corridors, aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, enormous and dangerous but providing enough meat to feed dozens of people from a single kill, wild boar in the forests, wild sheep and goats on the hillsides, cranes and ducks in the wetlands. This wasn't a landscape where people struggled to find their next meal. This was abundance. The animal bones at Göbekli Tepe tell the story. Archaeozoologists have analysed thousands of bone fragments from the fill layers. Gazelle dominates. Over 60% of identified bones come from gazelles, and not just a few scattered individuals. The bone assemblages suggest mass kills, entire herds being taken at once using drive techniques. You herd them into a confined space, a canyon or a constructed enclosure, and you take as many as you can process. But here's what makes it interesting. The age profiles of the gazelle remains don't match what you'd see from year-round subsistence hunting. They match what you'd see from seasonal hunting, focused on specific times of year when herds were most concentrated. This is feasting evidence. The sheer quantity of animal bones, the patterns of butchery, the way remains were deposited, it all suggests periodic gatherings where massive amounts of meat were consumed, not careful rationing of scarce protein. Abundance, waste, the kind of surplus you get when hundreds of people come together for celebrations that last days or weeks. And here's what's crucial. There's virtually no evidence of permanent occupation at Göbekli Tepe itself. No domestic structures, no storage buildings, no trash middens accumulated from years of daily life. The site was special purpose. People came here for specific reasons, probably at specific times, then left again. They weren't living on the hilltop, they were gathering there, so imagine the pattern. Small bands, maybe 20 to 40 people, extended family groups moving through their territories. They know this landscape intimately. They know when the wild cereals ripen, where the gazelle herds cross during spring migration, which oak groves produce the most acorns. They're not desperately searching for food. They're managing resources, making decisions about when to harvest, when to hunt, when to move to the next camp. But several times a year, maybe tied to seasonal changes or celestial events, the bands converge. Messages have been sent, agreements made. They gather at the hilltop, at Göbekli Tepe, the place that belongs to no single group but to all of them collectively. The place where their ancestors built the stone circles. The place where something sacred happens. They bring food, dried meat, harvested grains, nuts, whatever surplus they've accumulated. Because when they gather, they feast. They slaughter gazelles in quantities that would be wasteful for a single family but make perfect sense for a gathering of hundreds. They eat. They drink whatever fermented beverages they've learned to make. They conduct ceremonies we can only imagine, and they work on the temple. Because building Göbekli Tepe required organization on a scale that seems impossible for mobile hunter-gatherers. Quarrying a 15-ton pillar takes days, maybe weeks. Moving it takes dozens of people pulling in coordination. Raising it vertical requires engineering knowledge, planning, probably trial and error that resulted in broken pillars and crushed fingers. Carving the reliefs takes time, skill, artistic vision. You need specialists, someone who knows how to carve stone, someone who knows how to organize labor, someone who decides which animals go on which pillars. This is complex social organization. Hierarchy, probably. Specialists, certainly. Shared belief systems strong enough to motivate enormous collective effort. And it's all happening before agriculture, before permanent settlement, before any of the things we thought were prerequisites for this kind of society. The old model said agriculture created surplus. Surplus allowed specialization. Specialization led to social complexity, and social complexity eventually produced monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses the sequence. First came the gathering. First came the temple. Then, maybe because people were already gathering anyway, someone had the idea to plant some of those wild cereals near the enclosures, to keep gazelles penned instead of hunting them, to stay. The temple didn't emerge from civilization. Civilization emerged from the temple. For most of the 20th century, the story in the textbooks was tidy. First, people domesticated plants and animals. Agriculture created predictable surplus. Surplus allowed larger, more permanent settlements. Settlements produced social hierarchies and specialists. And only then, at the top of that pyramid, did you get temples, priests, and monumental stone architecture. Religion and ritual in this model were luxuries that came after full bellies, the icing on the cake of civilization. Göbekli Tepe walked in, 12,000 years old, and calmly flipped that cake onto the floor. Because on that windswept hill, the sequence seems to run in reverse. There is no clear evidence of domesticated wheat or barley when the earliest enclosures were built. No sheep or goats that are definitively under human control. No rows of houses clustered around the monument. The temple stands alone, centuries before anything we would comfortably call a farming village. And yet all the things we once thought only farmers could do are already happening. There is coordinated labour on a large scale. There are specialists, or at least highly skilled artisans, who know how to carve limestone into sleek T-shapes and wrap those pillars in belts and animal forms. There is planning spanning generations, enclosures built, used, buried, and replaced in a ritual cycle that must have carried myth and memory along with it. In the old narrative, you would expect that kind of complexity to emerge from a dense village of mud brick houses, with granaries and courtyard hearths and streets worn by daily traffic. At Göbekli Tepe, there's almost none of that. The domestic life is elsewhere. The monument is the thing that gathers people in and holds them, for a season, in one place. Klaus Schmidt understood how disruptive this was. When he began excavating in the 1990s, he was steeped in that classic Neolithic story. He had worked at Nevalachori, a nearby site that did fit the old model better. A small farming village of the early Neolithic with houses, clear evidence of domesticated plants, and, crucially, its own little stone sanctuary with T-shaped pillars inside. Ritual tucked neatly inside an already settled, already agricultural community. But at Göbekli Tepe, the sanctuary comes first. The village, if it ever existed on the same hill, has left almost no trace. Schmidt's response was quietly radical. Maybe he suggested we had the causality backwards. Maybe the decisive step toward farming wasn't someone accidentally dropping seeds near a campsite and discovering they sprout. Maybe the spark was social, not agricultural. Imagine the problem from the perspective of the people themselves. Several times each year, hundreds of individuals converge on this hill to feast, build, carve, bury, and rebuild. They need meat in astonishing quantities. They also need something else: carbohydrates, grains, starches. If you're organising a multi-week gathering with labour crews hauling 15-ton stones, you don't want to trust completely to whatever wild plants happen to be ripe that week. You want reliability. Schmidt's hypothesis is simple and unsettling. Perhaps it wasn't that farming allowed temples to be built. Perhaps the temple created the need for farming. If Göbekli Tepe became a fixed point in the landscape, a sacred rendezvous where calendars turned and stories were retold, then feeding those gatherings becomes a logistical challenge. You need predictable surpluses at predictable times. The wild stands of einkorn and barley scattered across the hills are generous, but they're also patchy and timing is fickle. The answer over generations might have been to start tending the plants you already depended on, to weed a patch, to scatter extra seeds in promising soil, to harvest more carefully, leaving some heads intact for resowing near the gathering place. Not because you're trying to invent agriculture in an abstract sense, but because you have a recurring social obligation. Show up at the temple with food, share in the feasts, fulfill your part in the ceremonies, meet your in-laws, arrange marriages, renew alliances, mourn the dead, tell the old stories under the stars. You don't farm because it's more efficient. You farm because you have to be there. In that light, domestication isn't an economic breakthrough. It's a side effect of ritual. This idea sounds dramatic, but it doesn't rest on Göbekli Tepe alone. The surrounding region, the Taş Tepeler, stone hills, is dotted with cousins and siblings of the hilltop sanctuary. Karahan Tepe, 50 kilometers to the southeast, has its own enclosures, its own T-shaped pillars, its own sculptural language. Nevelachori, now lost beneath the waters of a dam reservoir, showed those same T-pillars integrated into a proper village plan. At Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe and other sites, similar architectural elements appear: stone circles, central pillars, communal spaces far more elaborately built than any individual dwelling. Taken together, they suggest a regional tradition. Communities scattered across the upper Euphrates and upper Tigris valleys seem to be experimenting with a new idea, that some places are not just campsites or hunting blinds, but permanent centres of meaning, fixed sacred cores that outlast any single building or band. And around those sacred cores, other changes gather. At later sites in the region, the botanical record begins to shift. Wild cereals are still present in huge quantities, but grain and chaff show subtle morphological changes. Thicorechis, altered seed attachment points, the tiny anatomical fingerprints of domestication. At Nevelachori, at Çayönü further to the east, you see houses clustering, storage facilities becoming more elaborate, human burials integrated into building foundations. The world is sliding, slowly, toward village life. The temptation is to force a simple story here. Temples caused farming, but the closer archaeologists look, the messier and more interesting the picture becomes. Göbekli Tepe is older than clear evidence of domesticated plants, but people in the region were already intensively exploiting wild cereals before the first pillars were raised. They had sickles with glossy useware from cutting stems. They had grinding stones worn smooth by years of processing grain. In some places, semi-sedentary camps predate the most elaborate ritual centres. In others, the biggest monuments appear before any lasting settlement. Instead of a neat ladder, first agriculture, then villages, then temples, what emerges is more like a web. Ritual gatherings, intensive use of wild resources, early cultivation, seasonal aggregation, and emerging social hierarchies are all tangled together, influencing each other in feedback loops. You call people to a sacred hilltop, and that makes it worthwhile to plant nearby. You begin to tend plants, and that makes it easier to hold bigger gatherings more often. Larger, more regular gatherings create pressure for clear leadership, for shared rules, for mythic narratives that legitimize who stands at the center and who works at the edges. Those leaders may then direct even more ambitious building projects. And those projects, in turn, strengthen people's attachment to the place, making it harder to leave the landscape entirely when the season changes. By the time you reach the classic Neolithic villages of the later 10th and 9th millennia BCE, ritual buildings and ordinary houses are interwoven like warp and weft. Some communities have a single special structure used by everyone. Others distribute symbolic elements, skulls, horns, painted walls, through many homes. The temple is no longer set apart on a bare hill. It is diffusing into everyday life. This more nuanced view is where many archaeologists now sit. Agriculture did not simply cause religion, nor did religion single-handedly cause agriculture. Both seem to arise together from deeper human needs, the desire to anchor identity in stories and places, the craving for predictability in an unpredictable world, the joy and tension of big gatherings where alliances are made and broken. Göbekli Tepe stands at a turning point where those needs crystallized in stone. It suggests that when humans took the first steps toward living in one place, they may have been guided as much by invisible things, myths, obligations, shared visions, as by the visible calculus of calories and harvests. It is easy from a modern perspective to imagine that material comfort drives everything, that once you have enough food you can afford art, temples, philosophy. But those T-shaped pillars on the Anatolian plateau hint at a different priority list. People were willing to haul monoliths and carve foxes and vultures long before they had secure harvests. They were willing to invest staggering time and energy into a place that gave them no permanent shelter, only meaning. If that's true, then the Neolithic Revolution was not just an economic transition. It was a reorganization of what mattered. The first semi-permanent nodes in the human landscape may have been not granaries, but sanctuaries. Not markets, but meeting grounds where the sacred, the social and the practical fused. First the temple, then the city, or at least temple and field and village rising together, each drawing strength from the others, and beneath it all, a very old pattern. Humans gathering round shared beliefs, shaping the land and themselves in the process. If the architecture of Göbekli Tepe is shocking, the art carved into it is even stranger. Walk around those stone circles in your mind and let your eyes move over the pillars. They are alive. There are foxes caught mid-pounce, muscles taut, snouts stretched forward as if they might leap off the limestone at any second. There are snakes, not as little background squiggles, but as thick, deliberate coils that wind around the edges of pillars, heads raised, bodies almost pulsing with motion. Vultures stand with wings half spread, heavy beaks hooked, as though they've just landed or are about to launch into the air again. Boars bristle with carved fur, backs arched, tusks and shoulders rendered with a clarity that suggests the sculptors knew exactly how those animals moved. It feels less like decoration and more like a gallery of presences. And it's not random. The animals repeat. Foxes show up again and again. So do snakes, wild boar, cranes, vultures, scorpions, wild asses. Some pillars are almost crowded with them, a vertical procession of teeth and claws and feathers. To carve like this in limestone with stone tools takes time, planning. You don't spend hours pecking out a fox that wraps perfectly around a pillar edge by accident. Archaeologists talk about iconographic programs, a fancy way of saying the images seem to be part of a thought-out system. Someone decided which animals went where. Someone cared enough to make sure the same creatures kept returning. If you're used to later prehistoric art, you might expect that these would simply be pictures of the animals people hunted and ate. A kind of visual diary or maybe hunting magic, images meant to help ensure a good kill. But the bones in the trash heaps tell a different story. When researchers sift through the food, remains from Göbekli Tepe, what they find in overwhelming quantities are the usual suspects of the local steppe: gazelle, wild sheep, wild aurochs cattle. These are the animals that filled the cooking pits and roasting fires. Yet on the pillars, gazelle are almost completely absent. The key prey species, the everyday staples, barely appear at all. Instead, the stars of the stone are often animals that were dangerous to approach or not particularly worth hunting for meat. Foxes, snakes, big birds of prey, scorpions, carnivores, scavengers, creatures that live in burrows, in the air, in the cracks between things. That mismatch is one of the clues that the carvings are not simply illustrations of daily life. They're about something else. What that something else is, of course, is where the arguments begin. One line of thought sees these animals as totems, markers of identity. In many later societies, clans or lineages associate themselves with a particular creature. The wolf people, the eagle people, the bear people. The animal becomes a kind of shorthand for the group's ancestry, its origin story, its shared obligations. If Göbekli Tepe was a gathering point for bands scattered over a wide landscape, the different pillars might have belonged symbolically to different groups. We carve foxes, they carve cranes. Those people over there are under the sign of the boar. In that reading, the stone circles are like a map of social relationships, written in fur and feathers instead of names. Another possibility is that these are cosmological beings, guardians, boundary keepers, or spirits associated with different parts of the invisible world. Snakes and scorpions have a way of standing in for danger in many traditions. Vultures and other carrion birds often hover around ideas of death and transformation. The animals might have been understood less as natural creatures and more as owners of specific realms, below ground, in the sky, at the water's edge, on the haunted margins between safe camp and wild unknown. Some anthropologists push the idea further into shamanic territory. In many hunter-gatherer cultures, certain individuals act as intermediaries between the human community and the spirit world. They journey in dreams or trance, accompanied by helper animals, or transformed into animal form themselves. The repeated motifs at Göbekli Tepe, fox, snake, vulture, might be the visual vocabulary of those journeys. Spirit allies, dangerous companions, beings encountered on the other side of ordinary perception. There's also a more straightforward, almost psychological reading. Perhaps the pillars are a catalogue of threats. Foxes that steal meat, snakes that bite, boars that charge, scorpions that sting, vultures that arrive when bodies lie exposed, a wall of carved reminders of everything that can go wrong out there, gathered and tamed in stone, turned into something you can face and name. All of these ideas are plausible. None can be proven. But when you look closely at certain scenes, the themes of danger and death begin to stand out. Across the site, human figures do appear, but they are rare and often presented in unsettling ways. Some are headless, with arms and hands carved but no face, or with the head deliberately removed in antiquity. On some reliefs, small, simplified humans seem almost harassed by the swirl of animals around them, as if engulfed by powers beyond their control. Then you notice the vultures. In one carved panel, a vulture stands tall, wings extended beside what may be a headless human body, or at least a human-like form. Above it, a round object floats, too round to be a random rock, suspiciously like a human skull or severed head. Similar motifs turn up at other early Neolithic sites in the region. At Mythology, not far from Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found human skulls that had been removed from burials and curated separately. At Çatalhöyük, 1,000 years later, wall paintings show vultures standing over headless bodies, while real skulls were plastered and repainted, kept in houses like relics. Put together, these strands have led many researchers to suspect some kind of vulture and skull cult stretching across early Neolithic Anatolia and the northern Levant. a shared set of practices and images focused on what happens to the body after death, on separating the head from the torso, on exposing remains to birds that clean the bones. Göbekli Tepe may be one of the earliest places where that symbolic complex is carved into architecture on a monumental scale. The most famous example is Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, the so-called vulture stone. It has become almost a character in its own right in the modern story of the site. On this single pillar face, an entire busy scene unfolds. Near the top, a large vulture spreads its wings. Below, another bird, perhaps a smaller vulture or a stork-like creature, struts along. To one side, a scorpion stretches out its pincers and tail. Other animals, maybe a wild ass, maybe more birds, fill the remaining space. Again, there is that enigmatic round object near the bird, suggestive of a severed head or sun or something in between. It's a dense composition, laid out in horizontal registers like a narrative panel. But the story it tells is opaque. Some archaeologists interpret the vulture stone as a straightforward mortuary scene, a representation of excarnation, the laying out of bodies for birds to pick clean, followed by some ritual handling of skulls. In that reading, the pillar stands as a permanent reminder of how a proper death should be managed, a stone manual for returning the body to the earth, and the soul to wherever souls were believed to go. Others see cosmology rather than funerary practice. Vultures in the sky, scorpions near the ground, different animals marking different layers of the universe, upper, middle, lower worlds, joined together on the upright stone that links earth to heaven. The round object could be the sun, or a star, or a symbolic soul being carried upward. And then there are the more adventurous theories. A few researchers have argued that the arrangement of animals on Pillar 43 corresponds to constellations, that the vulture stone is an early star map, maybe even a record of a specific astronomical event, like a comet or meteor shower remembered in myth. In their reconstructions, the scorpion becomes Scorpio, the bird becomes a particular star cluster, the round object a celestial marker. If true, Göbekli Tepe would not only be one of the world's earliest temples, but also one of its first observatories. Most archaeologists greet such precise identifications with caution. The temptation to project familiar constellations backward in time is strong. So is the urge to turn every mystery into a code ready to be cracked. But the further we go into this kind of decoding, the more we risk seeing our own patterns rather than theirs. That, in the end, is the humbling part of this language in stone. We can see that the carvings are systematic. We can chart which animals cluster together, which motifs recur, which pillars seem to form pairs or oppositions. We can trace parallels to later practices, skull removal here, vulture scenes there, and build reasonable bridges of interpretation. But we do not know the words they spoke when they pointed at these carvings. We do not know the myths parents told their children as they ran their hands over the foxes and snakes. We don't know which images made people laugh, or shiver, or fall silent. The grammar of this symbolic system has been lost. We are left with single, powerful nouns: fox, vulture, snake, head, circle. The verbs and conjunctions that tied them into full sentences, those are gone. Still, the stone speaks in its own way. It tells us that by 9500 BCE, on a hill in southeastern Anatolia, humans were already thinking in layers of meaning, about death and danger, about identity and the invisible, about how to bind those things to place. They chose animals as their alphabet and pillars as their pages. They carved their fears and hopes into limestone, trusting that the figures would stand long after any individual storyteller had gone. We stand at a distance of 12,000 years, squinting at those same foxes and vultures, trying to hear the sentences behind them. And even if we never fully succeed, the effort itself reminds us that symbolic thought, This urge to make marks that stand for more than themselves is as deep a part of us as stone and bone and grain. The pillars are not just architecture. They're conversation pieces in an ongoing dialogue between the living and the dead, the human and the more than human, the seen and the unseen. And at the centre of that dialogue stand the T-shaped figures themselves, those silent, abstracted giants. To understand them, we have to ask an even stranger question. Who, exactly, were the pillars meant to be? If the animals are the language, the T-shapes are the speakers. Walk into enclosure D in your mind and look past the foxes and vultures for a moment. What dominates the space isn't the carvings at the edges, but the two enormous pillars in the centre. They're not just posts, they're figures. Each of those central monoliths stands nearly 5.5 meters tall, towering over the ring like stone giants. At first glance they seem simple, a vertical shaft with a crossbar on top, like a capital T. But when you look more closely, when you let your attention settle, you start to see the human hiding inside the geometry. Along the sides, low on the shaft, shallow reliefs emerge, arms bent at the elbows running downwards. The hands are turned forward, fingers long and elegant, reaching toward the front of the pillar where a belt is carved, complete with buckle and hanging loincloth. On some, a fox pelt drapes like a stole. These aren't random decorations. They occupy the same place on the pillar where a person's arms and hands and hips would be. Archaeologists call these anthropomorphic pillars for a reason. They are bodies in disguise. And yet, for all that bodily detail, something is missing. There are no faces. The tops of the pillars, those big crossbars that first catch the eye, are utterly blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Sometimes there are necklaces or symbols just under the neck area, but the head itself remains an empty, featureless block. It's as if the sculptors went out of their way to say, yes, this is a person, but not any person you know. That deliberate facelessness is part of the mystery. In later statues, when people want to honour a leader or ancestor, they often do the opposite. They emphasise the face, the individuality. Here, at Göbekli Tepe, the human form has been abstracted to its bare essentials. Torso, arms, hands, belt, no personal identity, no expression. Who, then, are these beings meant to be? One family of interpretations sees them as ancestors. In many small-scale societies, the dead don't simply depart. They remain as powerful presences woven into the landscape, watching over their descendants, demanding respect. Houses might be built over burials, skulls might be kept and displayed. Lineages claim territory not just by living there, but by saying, our forebears are in this ground. If Göbekli Tepe functioned as a gathering place for scattered groups, those central pillars could be ancestor spirits made visible. Not grandpa or grandma as individuals, but the deep collective people before us that multiple bands trace themselves back to, faceless because they stand for all, not one. The smaller pillars that form the ring might then be like a congregation of lesser spirits, clan ancestors, group patrons, standing around the two great founding figures in the middle, each ring a kind of stone family tree. There is some circumstantial support for this reading in the region. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, in the modern city of Şanlıurfa, workers in the 1990s uncovered a strange statue during construction. It's now known as the Urfa Man. He's about life-sized, carved from limestone, with a stylized body and hands clasped to his abdomen. The eyes were once inlaid with black obsidian. The face is simple, but unmistakably human. He dates to roughly the same period as Göbekli Tepe, making him the oldest known life-sized human sculpture yet found. Urfa Man looks uncannily like a small, detailed cousin of the faceless pillars. Upright posture, hands to the belly, a kind of formal stillness, Some researchers think both belong to the same symbolic world, different expressions of a shared concept of the human, perhaps the honoured dead or mythic founders fixed in stone. Then there's the broader pattern of ancestor veneration in the early Neolithic Near East. Across sites in Syria, Turkey and the Levant, archaeologists have found evidence of skull plastering, human skulls removed from burials, the faces rebuilt in plaster, sometimes with shells for eyes and paint for hair. These reconstructed heads were then kept in houses or special rooms, revisited and handled long after the rest of the body had returned to the earth. It's hard not to see this as a way of making the dead present, giving them a kind of second, more permanent body, somewhere to live among the living. Göbekli Tepe fits into this world of skulls and ancestors and curated bones, even though, so far, it hasn't yielded clear burials inside its main enclosures. The vulture scenes suggest exposure of bodies, the carved headless humans hint at deliberate decapitation. The whole symbolic package feels preoccupied with the transition from person to ancestor, from living body to enduring presence. If the plastered skulls were intimate, indoor shrines to specific individuals, the Göbekli pillars may be the public outdoor counterpoint. Large, abstract, communal embodiments of the dead as a category. Ancestors scaled up to architecture. Other scholars push the interpretation beyond ancestry into the realm of gods. From this angle, those faceless colossi are not just the remembered dead, but something more. Supernatural beings, personified forces, maybe the earliest glimmers of deities. The blank faces then become a feature, not a bug. These aren't meant to be recognizable humans, they're intentionally other. Imagine approaching Enclosure D at night, torches flickering, darkness pooled between the stones. The two tallest pillars stand in the centre, perfectly aligned, flanked by their ring of lesser columns. The carved hands clasped to belts give them a poised, contained power. You step into a circle where stone people vastly outsized any living person, presiding silently over whatever is about to happen. It feels like a council chamber or a sanctuary, where humans come into the presence of beings that are more than human. Under this reading, the smaller pillars might represent different spirits, forces, or even social groups, all facing the two central beings that hold the ritual focus. The entire space becomes a kind of stone theatre. The central aisle between the big pillars, the stage where ceremonies took place while the carved company looked on. There's also a middle path. Perhaps those categories, ancestor and god, weren't clearly separated in the first place. In many traditional cosmologies, the great ancestors shade naturally into divine figures. The first hunter, the founding grandmother, the culture hero who taught people how to grind grain. Over generations their stories grow until they stand halfway between human memory and mythic time. To honour them is both filial duty and religious act. The Göbekli pillars could be embodiments of such beings, mythological founders whose names we'll never know, encoded instead in belts, fox pelts, and abstracted forms. Faceless because by the time the stones were raised, the stories had already blurred into legend. There's another intriguing possibility as well, that the pillars, especially in their facelessness, embody not particular individuals at all, but a kind of collective identity. Think of them as the person of the community made solid, a symbolic body that stands for the gathered we, rather than any I. In that sense, stepping into the circle would mean stepping into the shared self of the people who built it, affirmed and stabilized by stone. The parallels with other pre-pottery Neolithic sites help here too. At Navali Chori, now lost under a reservoir but excavated before the waters rose, archaeologists found smaller T-shaped pillars in a building interpreted as a cult structure. At Karahantiye and other members of the Tepe Stone Hills group, similar T-forms and human-animal hybrids appear. The motif of an abstracted, oversized human presence was clearly not a one-off. It belonged to a regional way of thinking. Taken together, these strands suggest that Göbekli Tepe sits near the beginning of something enormous, the organized human attempt to give shape to the invisible. Not necessarily religion in the later institutional sense. No texts, no dogma, no priestly caste we can clearly identify, but a shared symbolic framework, a set of agreed-upon forms and spaces where questions about death, origin, and belonging could be acted out. The spatial drama of the enclosures reinforces this. The inward-facing ring of pillars, all oriented toward the central pair, creates a strong sense of directionality. Attention is pulled to the middle, where a human body might stand between two stone bodies, becoming the temporary link between the ordinary and whatever the pillars represented. You can imagine rituals where people processed into the circle the interior, left offerings at the bases, touched the carved hands. Maybe stories were told about the people of stone and how they made the world safe, or dangerous, or meaningful. Maybe initiations took place there, or seasonal gatherings that renewed bonds between far-flung groups. We don't know the scripts of those ceremonies. We only see the stage. But even that is telling. By 9500 BCE, people here were already willing to pour staggering amounts of labor into building places whose primary function was symbolic, not practical. Places where stone was shaped into beings, neither fully human nor fully animal, neither entirely of this world nor wholly outside it, that could anchor a shared imagination. The pillar people stand at the threshold between our distant foraging past and the more familiar religious landscapes of later history. They are among the earlier silhouettes of the sacred carved at monumental scale. And they are not alone on the Anatolian plateau, because as later excavations have made clear, Göbekli Tepe was not a solitary miracle. It was one hilltop in a whole constellation of stone sanctuaries. For a long time, Göbekli Tepe looked like a freak event in the archaeological record, a one-off spark of genius on a lonely hill. Then the survey teams kept walking. If you pan your mental map out from Göbekli Tepe just a little, you start to see more humps on the horizon. Low rises, rounded knolls, places where, to a trained eye, the soil looks just a bit too lumpy, the stones just a bit too regular. Some of those bumps have names: Karahan Tepe, Harbetsvan Tepesi, Sefer Tepe, Cyberch, and more, still half buried, scattered across the Şanlıurfa region of southeastern Turkey. Taken together, they're now referred to as the Tepe, the Stone Hills. Not one site, but a project. An entire landscape of early Neolithic activity, all dating to roughly the same window as Göbekli Tepe, all showing variations on the same stunning theme. Hunter-gatherers shaping stone into meaning at a scale nobody thought possible. Once you know that, Göbekli Tepe stops being an isolated miracle. It becomes the best preserved chapter of a wider story. The most dramatic of its siblings, at least so far, is Karahan Tepe. Karahan lies about 35 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe as the crow flies. Same general region, same broad upland terrain. On the surface, it used to look unremarkable, another stony rise in a stony country. But remote sensing, field walking, and then serious excavation have turned that anonymous hill into one of the most intriguing sights on the planet. Like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe has T-shaped pillars. They're smaller on average, more tightly packed, but unmistakably part of the same visual language. Vertical shafts with crossbars, some carved with belts and arms, some surrounded by animal reliefs. The pillar people were clearly not a one-site idea. They were a regional motif. But Karahan has its own personality, its own obsessions. One of the most striking features is an oval building sunk into the bedrock, accessed by steps. Along the perimeter, a low bench has been carved directly out of the living stone, and rising from that bench, in a row, are what look like pillars that never quite escape the rock. Tall, narrow necks topped with stylized heads. No bodies, just cranial forms projecting from the stone, shoulderless and rigid. It's as if a line of figures is emerging from the earth itself, frozen halfway between geology and personhood. Some have described it as a head cult chamber. Others see it as an architectural metaphor. The hill as a body, the carved heads as people or spirits erupting from within. Whatever its exact interpretation, the space feels different from the open rings at Göbekli Tepe. More enclosed, more focused. A place where being surrounded by heads, by presences, was the whole point. Then there are the phalluses. In one zone at Karahan Tepe, excavators exposed multiple large, clearly carved, explicitly phallic pillars rising from the bedrock. They're not accidental shapes. They're intentional, repetitive, and prominent. What they mean is up for debate. Fertility, masculine power, a ritual emphasizing generative forces in a harsh environment where each new life was precarious and precious, or something stranger, rooted in myths we no longer have words for. Whatever the case, Karahan Tepe shows that these early builders were comfortable with stark, overt symbolism. The human body, its heads, its genitals, was raw material for architecture as much as stone and earth. And then, unlike Göbekli Tepe in its earliest investigated phases, Karahan Tepe gives us something very down-to-earth, clear domestic structures. Around the more overtly ritual buildings, archaeologists have found smaller rooms, hearths, installations that look suspiciously like everyday living spaces. That's important. For years, Göbekli Tepe was interpreted as a purely special-purpose site, a place you travelled to, feasted at and left. No houses, no permanent residence, a hill for ceremonies, not for sleep. Karahan complicates that picture. Here, the sacred and the mundane sit cheek by jowl. Spaces for elaborate symbol-laden gatherings sit right next to what look like places where people cooked, knapped stone, and warmed themselves. It suggests that whatever was happening on these hills wasn't always a pilgrimage from far away. Sometimes it might have been life at home, and Karahan is just one member of the Stonehills family. At Harbetsuvan Tepe, another site in the same regional cluster, excavators have revealed smaller T-shaped pillars and stone features echoing the Göbekli style. The scale is more modest, but the logic is familiar. Upright stones formalizing a space, animal imagery marking boundaries between ordinary and special. Sefer Tepe, known from surveys and limited work, appears to preserve yet another variation on the theme. More T-shapes, more deliberate architecture, hinting that almost every significant rise in this landscape might conceal some chapter of the same cultural experiment. Then there is Saburs. Saburs came to wider attention when archaeologists uncovered a carved stone panel embedded in the wall of a building. It shows a human figure in dynamic pose grasping a bull with one hand and a leopard with the other. The animals are rendered with power and tension. The human stands between them, arms outstretched in a composition that feels astonishingly like a scene, a moment, a narrative. It's not just a random collection of creatures as many earlier Göbekli reliefs could be read. It's a relationship, human to bull, human to leopard, all bound together in a single composition. Some researchers have argued that this may be one of the earliest known examples of narrative art. A story in stone, maybe a mythic episode, maybe a stylized hunting rite, maybe an origin tale told around embers and then fixed on the wall so it wouldn't fade. Whatever the story was, Saburs shows that the symbolic world of the Tashtapela was not static. It evolved, it experimented, It moved from stacked catalogues of animals to more overtly staged scenes. When you put all these sites on a map, patterns begin to emerge. They're not random dots. They cluster along certain ridges and water sources, forming what could be imagined as a sacred geography, a constellation of hills where people gathered, carved, feasted, and remembered. The similarities, the T-pillars, the animal reliefs, the human-animal hybrids, tell us there was a shared mental toolkit across the region. Ideas, motifs, maybe even specific stories were circulating over tens of kilometers. At the same time, the local quirks, the head chamber at Karahan, the phallic grove, the narrative panel at Saburs, suggest that each community also put its own spin on the shared style. This implies networks, communication, perhaps seasonal movements that took people from one hill to another, revisiting certain places at certain times of year in a kind of ritual circuit. It is not hard to imagine pilgrimage routes, though we should be careful with the word. Not organized in the later sense, with official doctrine and centralized authority, but recurring journeys all the same. A band from one valley travelling to a sister hill for a midwinter gathering, visitors bringing obsidian or shells, hosts slaughtering animals, offering meat and story in exchange for news and alliances. In that sense, Taş Tepeler may represent one of the earliest visible ritual landscapes on Earth, not a single sanctuary, but a whole terrain woven together by meaning. And because we now have more than one example, earlier assumptions based on Göbekli Tepe alone are being revisited. If Karahan Tepe has domestic architecture mixed in with its monumental structures, might later levels at Göbekli also hide houses we've simply not recognized yet? If Saburs preserves narrative reliefs alongside standing stones, should we expect more explicit story panels at other hills, currently buried? The more hills we open, the more we see that temple versus village, ritual versus domestic, were probably not cleanly separated categories for these people. Sacred buildings grew out of the same communities that knapped flint and roasted gazelle. The line between ceremony and daily life was likely more porous than our tidy modern labels suggest. Recognizing the wider Stonehills network has also changed things in the present. The Turkish government has poured significant resources into the Taş Tepeler project, funding excavations, creating protective shelters, planning visitor centres, and promoting the region as a cradle of early monumental architecture. For Turkey, this is not just about science, it's about heritage, about being able to say, on these hills, at the dawn of settled life, people were already dreaming in stone. For archaeologists, the investment means something else. Time, tools and teams to peel back more of the earth gently, layer by layer. Each season adds new pieces to a puzzle that 30 years ago nobody even knew existed. And for us, drifting through this story at the edge of sleep, Taş Tepeler offers a comforting kind of perspective. Göbekli Tepe was never a lone stroke of genius by an isolated group. It was one voice in a chorus stretching across the hills. An entire region of hunter-gatherers had begun to think in monuments, to inscribe their questions about life and death and power into the bedrock itself. The stone hills remind us that when something new appears in human history, a way of building, a way of believing, it rarely does so in perfect solitude. It arrives as a pattern, a wave, a shared experiment humming through many minds at once. And on these Anatolian hilltops more than 11,000 years ago, that shared experiment was just beginning. When you put all of that together, the stone hills, the pillars, the animal stories, you can probably feel the next question forming. If hunter-gatherers were carving an entire symbolic universe into stone this early, what exactly were they doing? That's the space where the controversial theories step in. The places where the evidence thins out and imagination rushes to fill the gaps. Let's start with a single stone. Among the many pillars at Göbekli Tepe, one has become a kind of celebrity. Pillar 43 in enclosure D, You can picture it as a narrow stone canvas covered in images, a vulture with outstretched wings, a scorpion, a headless human form, other birds, other symbols, stacked and arranged with a care that doesn't feel random. To most archaeologists, it's a dense piece of Neolithic symbolism. Maybe a scene about death and the journey of the soul. Maybe a ritual landscape in miniature. Maybe something we don't have the right mental furniture to understand. But in 2017, two researchers, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, proposed a different reading. They suggested that the images on Pillar 43 are not just animals, but constellations. That the scorpion, for instance, stands for the constellation Scorpio, the vulture for another star pattern. The whole pillar, in their view, is a kind of star map, an encoded record of the sky, and not just any sky. According to their calculations, if you match the animal groupings to particular parts of the heavens, they appear to point to a specific date, around 10,800 BCE. That's very close to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, a sharp, sudden return to cold conditions after the last ice age seemed to be easing. Some geologists and impact researchers have argued that this climate snap was triggered by a fragmented comet hitting the Earth, a controversial idea in its own right. Sweatman and Tsikritsis went a step further. They argued that Pillar 43 is a memorial to that impact event, a stone record of the day the sky fell. In their model, Göbekli Tepe's builders were not just ritual specialists. They were careful observers of the heavens, tracking precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, well enough to encode dates using constellations. In other words, very early astronomers. It's an intriguing picture, a sanctum of sky watchers, preserving the memory of a catastrophe across thousands of years. Most specialists, though, remain unconvinced. There are problems. The animal constellation assignments are subjective. Different choices give different dates. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself is hotly debated, and there's no firm evidence that people of this period were tracking precession, a subtle effect that even later literate civilizations took time to pin down. For many archaeologists, the astronomical reading feels like a castle built on a few suggestive stones. Maybe there is some awareness of the sky encoded there. People everywhere have watched the stars since deep prehistory, but a precise date-stamped record of a specific cosmic event? That, they argue, asks more of the data than it can reliably give. Still, the idea sticks in the imagination. A temple that is also a time capsule. A climate disaster remembered in stone. It's a story that feels bigger than one hill, and that sense of bigness is exactly what pulls Göbekli Tepe into an even wider constellation of ideas, the lost civilization narratives. In the last few decades, writers like Graham Hancock have made Göbekli Tepe a centerpiece in a different kind of history. In this view, the stone hills are not the work of the first monument-building hunter-gatherers. They're the fingerprints of a forgotten advanced civilization, wiped out at the end of the Ice Age and remembered only in myths of Atlantis, flood stories, and wandering culture heroes. In Hancock's telling, survivors of this vanished culture may have travelled the world after a cataclysm, perhaps that same Younger Dryas event, teaching farming, stonework, astronomy. Göbekli Tepe, in that framework, becomes a kind of outpost or legacy project. The students work under the guidance of mysterious teachers from a fallen golden age. It's a compelling narrative. It connects dots across continents. It lets disparate mysteries, pyramids, megaliths, flood legends sit together in one sweeping story. Mainstream archaeologists, though, mostly reject it, not because they dislike drama, but because the evidence doesn't really need an Atlantis-class explanation. The skills on display at Göbekli Tepe, quarrying, carving, organizing labor, inventing symbols, are all things we see evolving step by step in different places as human groups grow, experiment and share ideas. We have no clear genetic trace of a separate, lost founding population sweeping in. no convincing artifacts that scream technology far beyond its time. What we have instead is a pattern. Local hunter-gatherers whose tools, bones and food remains run continuously through the layers, slowly transforming their way of life over centuries. For most researchers, that continuity matters. It suggests a story of gradual innovation and cultural creativity, not an injection of outside genius. Yet the lost civilization idea won't quite go away, partly because our evidence is incomplete, partly because there is something undeniably startling about people with no pottery, no metal, no cities, standing up pillars that would challenge much later societies. And that, in turn, feeds the most dramatic set of interpretations of all, the ancient alien narratives. For some, Göbekli Tepe feels too sophisticated, too early to be human in origin. The leap in symbolic expression, the sheer effort of moving and shaping such massive stones, the lack of obvious precursors, these become puzzle pieces assembled into a familiar picture. Extraterrestrial visitors inspiring, directing, or even building the site. The logic often runs quietly on an assumption that primitive people couldn't have done this alone, that hunters and foragers, without metal tools or wheels, were somehow too simple to organize complex projects or imagine layered mythologies. But when you step back, that assumption says more about us than about them. We know from countless ethnographic studies that small-scale societies can do extraordinary things with limited technology. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of ocean using stars, swells and bird flight. Indigenous Australians mapped landscapes and laws into songlines carried in memory, not stone. Arctic hunters built intricate social rules and survival strategies in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Human ingenuity is not a late invention. It's baked in deep. At Göbekli Tepe, experimental archaeologists have taken that seriously. They've gone back to basics: flint tools, wooden levers, rope made from plant fibers and animal hide. They've shown in practical trials that limestone pillars of comparable size can be quarried, shaped, moved, and raised using nothing more than the techniques available in the early Neolithic. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it's possible. Other researchers point to ethnographic parallels, seasonal gatherings where hundreds of people come together to build, to feast, to mark the turning of the year. Think of northwest coast potlatches, where status is performed through ritual and gifting, or megalith-raising ceremonies in parts of Indonesia, where whole communities move stones cooperatively, chanting as they walk. In that light, Göbekli Tepe stops looking like a technological impossibility and starts looking like an extreme version of a very human pattern. Groups investing huge amounts of shared labour into places that hold their stories, their identities, their contact with the sacred. So why then do the astronomical alignments, the Atlantis echoes, the alien visitors resonate so strongly? Part of it is the genuine mystery. Göbekli Tepe stands at the edge of what we can currently know. There are no written records, no clear descendants pointing back and saying, our ancestors did this for that reason. There is a gap between the scale of the monument and our expectations of the people who made it. Into that gap stories pour. Part of it is the human love of hidden knowledge, the sense that beneath the surface of familiar history lies a deeper layer, a secret architecture of lost ages and cosmic events. To imagine that a hill in southeastern Turkey encodes a message about comets or carries the legacy of a drowned civilization is to feel that the world is threaded with secret connections. And part of it is that grand narratives are soothing in their own way. A single, sweeping explanation, aliens, Atlantis, a lost order of astronomer priests, feels cleaner than the messy, incremental, deeply local process that archaeology usually reveals. The archaeological response to all of this isn't to crush wonder, it's to redirect it, to say, look at what ordinary humans can do when they're not really ordinary at all, when they're motivated, bonded by belief, and willing to pour generations of effort into shaping a hilltop. Imagine the conversations around those fires, the elders refining stories with each telling, the craftsmen experimenting with new carving techniques, the hunters planning the next feast, knowing it will bring together people who haven't seen each other since the last migration. No lost super races required for that. No visitors from the stars, just people with brains like ours, hearts like ours, living in a world that felt to them as vast and charged with meaning as any we could invent. In that sense, the mainstream explanation is not actually mundane. It might be the most awe-inspiring one of all, because it says that the capacity to raise pillars against the sky, to encode myth into stone, to remember and reshape the past, that capacity belongs to us, to our species, to communities with simple tools and complicated dreams. Göbekli Tepe doesn't need Atlantis to be magical. The magic is that 12,000 years ago, on a windy ridge above the plains, hunter-gatherers looked at an empty hill and saw a place where heaven and earth could meet. And then, stone by stone, they made that vision real. Which brings us to another mystery. After pouring so much effort into these monumental circles, after carving their animals and their pillar people and arranging everything with such care, they buried it. Deliberately, systematically, as if closing a chapter of their own story. Why would anyone fill in their own temples? Those beautiful stone circles, the fox pillars, the vultures, the strange T-shaped beings. They weren't left standing in the open, slowly collapsing under wind and rain. They were entombed. Every enclosure you've heard about, those great ring walls and towering megaliths, was eventually filled up from floor to rim with a dense, chaotic mixture. Broken stone, loose soil, smashed animal bones, flint flakes, worn-out tools, fragments of other carvings. In places, that artificial hill of rubble is several meters deep, more like the contents of 100 ancient trash heaps poured into a single basin than the gentle drift of time. And that's the first important point. This was not nature taking its course. Natural abandonment tends to be slow and uneven. Roofs fall in, walls slump, wind blows dust into corners. You get layers, thin and gradual, with clear signs of weathering between them. Göbekli Tepe isn't like that. The fill sits against the pillars in a way that says, this was tipped in, shoveled, carried, dumped. In some cases, large stones were dropped in whole, jammed between the T-shapes like wedges. The animal bones are not neatly sorted. They look like the leftovers of countless feasts scraped from hearths and middens and thrown in together. If you walked into one of those enclosures while the process was underway, it might have looked messy. Lines of people hauling baskets, others heaving rocks into place, the once careful floor disappearing under rising mounds of rubble. It feels almost destructive, yet that destruction is the reason the site is so eerily well preserved. By burying their own monuments under tons of compacted debris, the builders accidentally protected them from 10,000 years of erosion. They turned living sanctuaries into sealed time capsules. Why would anyone do that? Archaeologists reach for a phrase that sounds dry but hides a lot of emotion: ritual closure. In many cultures, sacred spaces are not meant to last forever. They have life cycles. They're born, they're used, and at some point they're decommissioned. Not by just walking away, but by actively ending them. Sometimes that means burning a shrine down. Sometimes it means smashing ritual objects. Sometimes it means carefully burying them so they can't be touched again. If you think of the enclosures as living, as inhabited, not only by people, but by whatever the pillars represented, then what happened at Göbekli Tepe may have been understood as a kind of death. a planned, necessary death. The pillars, with their belts and hands and animal companions, might have been seen as beings in their own right, gods, spirits, ancestor figures, or something in between. If their time had passed, if the stories or rituals had to change, you don't simply leave those beings exposed and unattended. You lay them to rest. You close the circle, literally and symbolically, by filling it in. There are echoes of this logic all around the world and across time. Among the Maya, for example, when a temple or pyramid complex reached the end of its ritual life, it was often terminated in a very deliberate way. Walls were dismantled, stairways smashed, offerings buried in corners or at the base of staircases, and then newer buildings were raised on top. Over centuries, entire cities became layer cakes of sacred architecture, each generation burying and building, burying and building. In many native North American traditions, sacred objects are ritually broken or interred when they are no longer to be used. In parts of Europe, Bronze Age swords and helmets were bent and thrown into rivers, not because they were trash, but because that act of destruction was itself an offering. The pattern is surprisingly consistent. You don't just discard the sacred, you transform it. You take it out of ordinary circulation. Seen in this light, Göbekli Tepe's burial doesn't have to be an act of rejection. It can be an act of respect, a final rite. But there's a twist in the layers that makes the story stranger. When archaeologists dig down through the artificial hill, they move through time in reverse. The youngest material is near the top, the oldest is deep down. That's standard. What's not standard is the relationship between time and complexity. At the very bottom, in what's called layer 3, you find the earlier structures, and they're the most grand. Huge circular or oval enclosures, T-shaped pillars up to 5.5 meters tall, densely decorated with reliefs and animals. Above them, in layer 2, you get later constructions. These are smaller, more rectangular, with shorter, less dramatic pillars. The art is still there, but the whole effect is more modest. In most archaeological sequences you see the opposite. Simple comes first, elaborate comes later. At Göbekli Tepe, it looks as if the people who arrived at the hill with this monumental vision gradually scaled it down, as if the first generation said, let's raise an entire stone cosmos, and their descendants, hundreds of years on, said, maybe something a little more compact. When you pair that with the repeated pattern of burial and rebuilding, earlier enclosure filled in, newer one set up nearby, it begins to look less like a single project and more like a series of cycles. A sanctuary lives, is honoured, and then, at some point, is deliberately killed and entombed. A new one rises, perhaps with slightly different rituals, slightly different stories. Over centuries, the energy, the resources, the sheer ambition invested in each new circle slowly diminishes. It's as if each burial is both an ending and a reboot, but the reboots get progressively smaller. What could drive that kind of slow decline? One possibility sits just off the hill, in the changing landscape below. While Göbekli Tepe was at its peak, the people who gathered there were still, for the most part, hunter-gatherers, highly mobile, living by wild gazelle, wild aurochs, wild grasses and fruits. The hilltop in that world was a special point of convergence, a place you travelled to, not a place you lived. But as the centuries passed, the world around them shifted. In the broader region, we start to see the first clear signs of domestication, wild wheat turning into something more like early crops, wild sheep and goats slowly becoming herds that humans manage. People begin to build more permanent houses in nearby valleys. Villages sprout up with stone foundations, storage bins, grinding installations. Agriculture isn't a single moment. It's a long, uneven process of trying things, keeping what works, abandoning what doesn't. But by around 8000 BCE, the people of this region are much closer to being farmers than foragers. And around that same time, Göbekli Tepe is abandoned altogether. The last small enclosures are filled. No new circles rise to replace them. The hill, now swollen with the bones of its own monuments, is finally left to the wind. It's tempting to link those two shifts, the rise of full farming and the death of the hilltop temples. Maybe the beliefs that had once drawn scattered bands together lost some of their pull when life settled into fields and permanent houses. When your gods live in your courtyard and your harvest depends on your own labour. A remote stone cosmos on a ridge might feel less central. Maybe the rituals moved down into the villages, into new kinds of shrines we haven't yet recognised, into household altars instead of towering pillars. Or maybe the meaning of the old symbols simply grew thin over time, stories that once rang like thunder weakening into echoes that no longer compel people to gather by the hundreds. We don't know. We probably never will know in detail. What we can see, though, is that the burial of Göbekli Tepe wasn't a single, sudden act. It was a slow folding away of a sacred tradition, layer by layer, circle by circle, as the people who had created it walked, generation by generation, into a different way of being human. At the end of that journey, the hill stands silent. Under your feet, meters of stone and bone and broken tools hold the memory of feasts, of chants, of hands smoothing limestone. Above may be a new kind of landscape, fields, flocks, villages with their own small stories. When you lie there in the dark, thinking about that buried temple mountain, you're touching the hinge where those two worlds met. The last breath of a hunter-gatherer cosmos, carefully, almost tenderly, covered over by the very people who had raised it. They did not leave it for us. They closed it for themselves. And yet, in sealing their past, they left a question open for the future. If a place this powerful can be built, used, loved, and then deliberately buried, what else have we forgotten about who we used to be? When archaeologists first began to understand what they were looking at on that hill, one of the quietest but most disruptive realizations was this: if this is right, then almost everything we thought about the order of things is backwards. The old story ran in a neat, comforting line. First, small groups of hunter-gatherers. Then, slowly, they settle down, domesticate plants and animals, build villages. Villages grow into towns. Towns grow into cities. Cities invent writing, governments, priesthoods. Only then, once you have food surpluses and organised labour and hierarchy, do you get great temples, monuments, and massive collective projects. Religion, in that version, is almost like an optional upgrade, a later add-on that complex societies can afford. Göbekli Tepe stubbornly refuses to fit. 12,000 years ago, on that ridge, we see the opposite sequence. First the monument, then, only much later, in the valley around it, the houses. People with no pottery, no metal, no permanent villages that we can see, somehow found the time, the energy, and the will to carve and move dozens of multi-ton pillars, to maintain a hilltop sanctuary for centuries, to feed workers and visitors who might have walked for days or weeks to get there. They did this not because they had excess food and spare labour lying around, but because they believed something together. That's the unsettling part. It suggests that the drive to create meaning, to gather around shared symbols, to mark out certain places as sacred and special, is not a late luxury of civilization. It is one of the forces that builds civilization in the first place. Imagine what that implies about the minds of the people climbing that hill. They weren't just thinking, where can we find game? Where is the next spring? They were holding stories big enough to move stones weighing as much as a truck, big enough to organize hundreds of people who did not share a village or a chief, big enough to keep them coming back for generations. In that light, Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological puzzle. It's a mirror held up to a part of ourselves we don't usually see. Because if hunter-gatherers could orchestrate something like this, with nothing but chipped stone and willpower, then our capacity for collective imagination, for shared purpose, is far more ancient and fundamental than our textbooks once allowed. It also forces us to rethink another quiet assumption, the idea that history is a simple climb from primitive to advanced, from rough to refined, from small to large. Walk down through the layers of the hill and that ladder collapses. At the bottom, the largest, most ambitious, most exquisitely carved circles. Above them, smaller, plainer, less imposing structures. If you mapped only the architecture, you might think the site started at its peak and then stepped down, as if the brightest flame came first and everything after was an afterglow. That's deeply at odds with the comforting narrative where our distant ancestors shuffle around in simplicity, and every century since is an improvement. Here, the people who lived earlier seem to have attempted something grander than their descendants. It doesn't mean they were better or more advanced in some absolute sense, but it does remind us that complexity is not a straight line. Human cultures surge and recede, ambitions swell, then deliberately contract. Sometimes the most monumental dreams belong to people we would, on paper, call simple. Looked at this way, Göbekli Tepe becomes a kind of warning against smugness. Our skyscrapers, our satellites, our data centers, they rest on a story where we imagine ourselves as the pinnacle. But 10,000 years before writing, people with stone tools and no cities were already taking on projects that still baffle us. Progress, it turns out, is not a staircase. It's a tangle of paths, some rising, some falling, some looping back into the forest. And in that tangle, one thread keeps appearing: imagination. On that hill, people carved beings that did not walk the earth in any straightforward way. T-shapes with hands and belts, part human, part abstract. Vultures escorting headless bodies, foxes striding in long profile bands, like thoughts running around the edge of a circle. Whatever those images meant, they were not just practical diagrams for hunting or gathering. They were symbols, tokens in a shared inner world. This is exactly the kind of thing that fascinates researchers in cognitive archaeology. The attempt to trace, in bones and stones, the birth and growth of symbolic thought. When did humans begin to treat images, objects and places as carriers of meaning that goes beyond their immediate use? When did we start telling stories that stretched before birth and after death, that linked animals and ancestors and stars into a single pattern? Göbekli Tepe sits right in that conversation. Its age pushes back the horizon of when such complex symbolic systems might have been in play. Its scale suggests those symbols were not private or idiosyncratic. They were shared by many bands, strong enough to coordinate feasts, rituals, perhaps seasonal gatherings of people who otherwise lived far apart. To cognitive archaeologists, the site is like catching a glimpse of a huge mental architecture, beliefs, myths, social rules, through the gaps between pillars. We see that ritual behavior, far from being frosting on the cake of settled life, may have been one of the ingredients that made large, stable communities possible. A shared sacred hill where you renew ties, exchange spouses, settle disputes, remember common origins, that can hold a loose network together just as powerfully as any political institution. In other words, people didn't simply invent temples because they already had villages. In this corner of the world, they may have built villages because for a long time they had a temple. Today, that temple mountain, flattened into an artificial hill by its own makers, is officially recognized as part of the world's shared heritage. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. With that honor came a new kind of challenge. For 10,000 years the enclosures lay sealed, protected by the very rubble that buried them. Now, exposed again to air and light and humans, they are vulnerable in ways their builders never imagined. Conservation teams have stretched protective roofs over the main excavated areas to shield the limestone from rain and harsh sun. They monitor tiny cracks, control moisture, worry about the salts that creep through stone when conditions shift. Tourism brings money and attention, but also footsteps, vibrations, and the constant pressure to open more, show more, dig deeper. And always there is a race between excavation and preservation. Every new trench risks destabilizing something. Every year left unexcavated is another year in which unknown structures remain safe, but also unknown. That tension circles back to the philosophical questions the site raises. We are desperate to see more, to know more, to peel back the layers of that artificial hill and the neighbouring mounds of the Tepe region, Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and the many others that still look, from a distance, like ordinary rises in the landscape. But each stone we uncover becomes our responsibility. Each pillar that sees daylight again begins a new, fragile life, dependent on our ability to care for it. So the archaeologist moves slowly, sometimes frustratingly so, leaving large parts of the hill untouched. They know that what remains buried may, paradoxically, be safer than what we have brought into the light. And that leaves us with a tantalizing thought. When you picture Göbekli Tepe now, with its revealed circles under white canopies and its walkways for visitors, remember that this is only a fraction of the story. Most of the hill is still filled with compacted debris that has not been sifted. Most of the surrounding mounds in the Tepe chain have barely been tested. Under those slopes may lie enclosures even older than the ones we know, new arrangements of pillars, different animals, different styles of carving that could shift our interpretations once again. Maybe there is a circle dedicated almost entirely to plants, hinting at rituals around the first experiments in cultivation. Maybe there is an enclosure where the T-shapes are smaller, more human-like, suggesting a different relationship between people and whatever those pillars represented. Or perhaps there are things we don't yet have the concepts to predict, forms of gathering, of honouring, of imagining, that would make us rewrite not only the history of religion or architecture, but our sense of what human minds were doing at the very dawn of settled life. Standing at the edge of that knowledge, we live in a strange in-between. We know enough to see that our old narratives were too simple. We don't yet know enough to replace them with something as neatly ordered. Instead, we have an unfinished picture, a buried stone cosmos on a hill, a cluster of similar hills nearby, a scattering of clues about feasts and rituals, and the slow turning toward farming. In that incompleteness, there is a kind of quiet invitation to remember that our species has been making meaning together for a very, very long time, to accept that progress is not a straight climb, but a series of experiments, some of which tower early and are then gently buried, and to hold, in the back of our minds, the awareness that under other hills, in other places, other forgotten worlds still sleep. At Göbekli Tepe, the people who built the first known temple did their best to hide it from the future. We, by uncovering it, have learned something humbling. We are not the beginning of the story. We are the ones who have arrived late, brushing dust off the remains of a world that had already asked and partly answered the question of what it means to be human, long before there were cities or writing or even fields of grain swaying in the wind. Now, as you settle in, let's let the hilltop grow dark again, not the fenced and roofed site of today, but the ridge as it might have been 12,000 years ago. The sun has slipped below the horizon. The last colours drain from the steppe. Up on the crest, between the stone circles, fires begin to glow, small wavering islands of light caught between pale pillars. The carvings flicker in and out of shadow. A fox's muzzle leaps into view, then vanishes. A vulture's wings seem to move as the flames breathe. The T-shapes, Those silent stone figures with their folded hands and belts stand in a loose crowd as if keeping watch. Around them, people settle down. Some have walked days to be here. Their feet are sore, their bellies full from shared food. Children doze against warm shoulders. Somewhere someone finishes a story in a low voice, a story about how the world began, or why the seasons turn, or what waits beyond death. Above all of them, the sky is crowded with stars. No light pollution, no cities, no engines. Just the Milky Way poured like a white river overhead. The same constellations we see now, the same turning dome of night. Those people do not know us. They do not know what a city is, or a satellite, or a screen. They have never heard the words Göbekli Tepe. But the thing that pulled them up this hill, the urge to gather, to carve symbols into stone, to stand together under the open sky and feel that there is more to life than hunting and hunger, that impulse is the same one that leads us to wonder about them all these millennia later. We sit in our rooms or lie in our beds and reach backward with our minds. They stood by their fires and reached outward with their stories. Same species, same restless curiosity, same need to belong to something larger than a single lifetime. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself there for a moment, leaning against one of those low stone walls, watching the coals settle and the stars wheel slowly overhead, part of a circle of people whose names are lost, but whose questions are our own. If this journey through the world's first known temple has kept you company tonight, you can gently help this little corner of the internet survive and grow. When you have a quiet moment, perhaps tomorrow, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. If you'd like, share where you're listening from, the city, the country, the landscape outside your window. One more web of connections stretching between distant places, just as those ancient gathering spots once linked scattered bands across the hills. And if your curiosity about these deep beginnings is still awake, even as your body grows heavy with sleep, you can explore further. At sleepytimehistory.com, there's a Sleepy Time history book on prehistoric secrets, stories of vanished worlds, early humans, and the mysteries they left behind, written in the same calm, drifting style, meant to be read in bed, with one foot already in a dream. For now, though, you don't have to solve any puzzles or remember any dates. The stones can keep their secrets a little longer. Let the hilltop fade. Let the pillars sink back into darkness. Let the stars above Göbekli Tepe become the stars above your own roof. You carry the long, unlikely history that led to that temple, and to you, quietly in every cell. Rest in that knowledge. May your night be peaceful, your dreams expansive, and your sleep deep and untroubled. Good night from the world's first temple.